This is Duke University.
Unfortunately, there are more weaknesses than strengths in the proposed Treasury plan. And let me go through some of the reservations that I have, and certainly a lot of market participants. After it was announced, the stock market at least dropped like a stone. And you wonder why. So let's kind of explore some of the reasons. The number one reason was the brevity. A 7-page fact sheet. We have had, months for the Treasury Secretary to think about a plan. And we are talking, $2 trillion of commitment. And the American taxpayer gets a 7-page fact sheet. It is unfortunately reminiscent of Secretary Paulson going to Congress with a 3-page piece of paper asking for $700 billion. So it doesn't make sense that it's so brief and so vague, and throughout the document we will work out the details later. So it really kind of smacks of this idea that let's just throw the ideas out and we'll figure it out later. And that, to me, doesn't instill a lot of confidence. I want to know what the strategy is, and I want to know what the details are. This is a serious problem that we're facing, a problem more serious than we've faced in generations. And it doesn't really make me feel good that the best they could do is a 7-page document. So that's one of the things that bothers me. The other thing has to do with transparency. And throughout the document, it actually talks about the need for increased transparency. And I've said, many times that I believe that transparency is a good idea. It's very important. And it seems like the document is talking to increase transparency. However, if you actually go to the fine print, there's something in it that is very disturbing. So basically, what it says in the document is that they will work with regulators and the accounting regulatory bodies to make sure that things aren't done that would actually harm or constrain lending. And to me, what that means is a movement away from mark-to-market accounting. And simply put, it means that a bank could carry an asset at an unrealistic value on their balance sheet. I think, to me, and most people I talk to, transparency means that you tell us what the value of the asset actually is, the fair value of the asset. Not some hypothetical value if certain things occur. I want to know what the value is if you have to sell that asset today. That, to me, is transparency. So throughout the document, they talk about transparency, yet when it comes down to the details, and the most fundamental detail, the most pressing need for us is to know the value of these financial institutions. We are putting money into them, hard-earned taxpayer money. At minimum, we need to know the value of the financial institution. Yet the wording is very clear here that there could be some interpretation that takes us away from fair value, that takes us away from transparency. So for me, the talk of transparency is basically a spin. The third thing that I was quite surprised by, and it's related to transparency, is the fact that before actually putting money in, the government will require a stress test. So let me explain what that is. A stress test is a scenario analysis, and we do this all the time. You look at kind of a good scenario, a bad scenario, and maybe an expected one in the middle. And the stress test is usually you look at the bad scenario, and what could go wrong, you ask those questions, and then in that scenario you make sure you've got enough capital so you survive. This is risk management 101. And the government is now requiring a stress test. Now, there are two things that bother me. The first is an outrage that they only now require a stress test, because we've dropped hundreds of billions of dollars, and it would be nice to have known that in putting this money in, that the financial institutions would be viable in the future according to their stress test. But no, we did basically nothing. We just gave them the money, okay, without requiring the most rudimentary due diligence, a stress test and evaluation. Nothing like that was done. The American taxpayer money was just doled out. The second thing that bothers me about this is a stress test critically relies upon fair value of your assets. But I already just told you that it seems like the government is going to move away from the fair value if it constrains lending. So if you don't use the true value of the assets, then the stress test is a joke. It's meaningless. It doesn't provide any reasonable economic information. So either you use the fair market value and do the stress test, or you don't. And a stress test without the fair market value is basically useless. Number 4, the private-public partnership to buy troubled assets. And this idea has been bandied about in many different forms. And I've got significant issues with this. The basic idea is that the government will lend some private investors some money so that they can go out and buy some of these troubled assets that the banks hold. Get the troubled assets off the balance sheet. That's a good idea, to get them off the balance sheet. But why should the government lend money to private investors to actually do that? So really what the government is doing is protecting the downside of the private investors, because they're lending the money, and then letting the private investors reap all of the upside. So the American taxpayer gets no return for this whatsoever. So let's be clear here. These private investors, these large private investors, their only interest is to maximize their return. And this might be very attractive for them. The government protects their downside, and then they go and buy the stuff. Hopefully there'll be a big payoff. It's an ideal situation for them, but not for us. So I think a much better strategy is something I proposed a long time ago, where the government simply goes in and buys at fair market value. And these financial institutions don't really have a choice. They need to sell. We need to get this stuff off their books. Buy at fair market value. The American taxpayer holds it for a period, maybe 5 to 7 years. These assets will recover, or many of them will recover in value. And the American taxpayer gets a return for their investment. So we get some of this money back. I think that's a better way to proceed. And the way that it's structured is extremely vague. I'm just not sure that it's viable. I guess the last reservation is the extreme sticker shock. And in the speech, the Treasury Secretary mentioned something like either do this or there's going to be a catastrophic failure. And I kind of read that two ways. One way is that he's got information that we don't have, and the financial system might already be completely insolvent. The other way to read it is kind of like fear-mongering. Both are scenarios I don't want to go to. But the size of this is staggering. $2 trillion. And if you think about it, with the so-called stimulus plan plus all the money we've committed, we're over $3 trillion. And I'd like to do this calculation where we've got 154 million Americans that are either working or unemployed and looking for work. That's like each person writing a check for $20,000. $20,000 to bail out the bad bets that these financial institutions actually made. Okay, so that's a problem. This is extremely unpopular. The size is massive. We knew that we were in trouble almost a year and a half ago. Nothing was done. And then we saw fumbling in September and October, where we could have arrested this problem at a fraction of the cost that we're talking about today. But no. And I expect more delays. And basically, where are we going to get this money? That's the question. That's the question. So there are three sources to pay for this. Okay, number one source is our savings. And Americans are saving more. So let's assume our savings rate goes to 7%. Right now it's about 3.5%. Well, that's going to generate $400 billion. That's not nearly enough to pay for this. Well, what's the number two source? Foreign investors. So we have to issue some bonds, and we'll be more in debt to foreign investors if they're willing to kick in multiple trillions of dollars to support the U.S. economy. And I think that is extremely dubious at this point. Number three, the printing press. That's our way out. So what does that mean? That means inflation in the future, and potentially very significant inflation. Basically, what we are doing today is we're trying to throw everything at this problem to minimize the job loss for next month and the month after. We're thinking of things that we can do in the short term, but we're not thinking about the long-term cost. We have to pay for this, and we will pay for it later. We will pay for it in slower growth, smaller income, and a debt burden that is likely to increase with all of the other programs that the government has entitled Americans to. So I think that now's the time to step back. Right now, $1 trillion is no big deal. There's got to be $1 trillion to be a significant program. Okay, I think we need to step back and assess the needs of the short term and measure that against the cost in the long term.